TIFU by asking my neighbor how to dispose of a 200 lamb solid lump before it turns into liquid. So, picture this, it's a Tuesday afternoon, 95 degrees in the shade, and I'm standing in my driveway, sweating through a shirt that used to be white but is now this weird translucent gray color, staring at my neighbor Gary, a retired cop who has seen actual dead bodies during his 20 years on the force. And I look him dead in the eye, my hands are shaking, my heart is doing that thing where it feels like it's trying to escape through my throat, and I say, Gary, I need your help. How do I dispose of a 200-pound solid lump before it turns into liquid? Now, before you judge me, before you jump to conclusions and think you figured out where this story is going, just know that in that exact moment, Gary's face did something I will never forget as long as I live. His eyes went from relaxed to wide to narrow to suspicious. In about half a second, he took a step back, his right hand. His dominant hand, the one that probably used to rest on his service weapon back in the day, twitched toward his pocket, and he looked at me like I had just confessed to something that would make the evening news. And the craziest part, I didn't immediately realize why he was looking at me like that, because in my head, in my completely panicked, adrenaline-soaked, sleep-deprived head, I genuinely thought I was asking a reasonable question about frozen water disposal. That's it, just water, just a physics problem. But I had forgotten one tiny, seemingly insignificant, detail. I had forgotten to mention that the 200-pound solid lump was actually a giant ice sculpture of Elsa from Frozen that I had made for my daughter's 5th birthday, that was currently fused to the floor of my $80 Facebook Marketplace chest freezer, and was melting so fast that my kitchen was about to become a swimming pool filled with bright blue food coloring. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. You don't know how I got there, you don't know the 3 weeks of insanity that led to that driveway conversation, you don't know about the YouTube tutorials, the $47 chisel set, the heat wave, the power outage, the fact that my wife was literally 10 minutes away from coming home and discovering that I had turned our garage into what looked like a crime scene from a very low-budget Smurf murder documentary. So let's back up, let's go back to the beginning, because every good disaster story, every legendary TIFU, starts with a single moment of overconfidence. And mine started with a 5-year-old girl. A Disney movie she had watched approximately 400 times, and a father who desperately wanted to be the hero. It was 3 weeks before my daughter's birthday, 3 weeks. And if you've never experienced the sheer terror of planning a child's 5th birthday party in the modern era, let me paint you a picture. It's not like when we were kids, right? When I turned 5. My mom bought a cake from the grocery store, threw some balloons on the mailbox, and called it a day. Maybe if I was lucky, and I mean really lucky, she'd invite the neighbors over and we'd play pin the tail on the donkey with a poster she got from the drugstore. But now we live in the age of Instagram parenting. Now we live in the era of Pinterest boards and TikTok party reveals and those insanely elaborate dessert tables that look like they were designed by a team of Hollywood set decorators. Every parent you know is posting these perfectly curated photos of their kid's birthday, with custom balloon arches and themed backdrops, and cakes that cost more than my first car. And I'm not saying this to complain about other parents, I'm just saying, the bar has been raised, the bar is so high it's in orbit, and as a dad, as a guy who works in accounting and whose idea of being creative is color-coding a spreadsheet, I felt that pressure, I felt it deep in my bones. My daughter, her name is Lily, and she is the absolute light of my life. She has these big brown eyes that see straight through your soul, and a laugh that sounds like someone shook a jar full of sunshine. And at the time of this story, she was in the grip of the most powerful force known to modern parenting, the frozen phase, and I'm not talking about a casual interest here. I'm not talking about she likes the song and moves on. No, this was a full-blown, all-consuming, life-altering obsession with Elsa, Anna, Olaf, and the entire fictional kingdom of Arendelle. She had the dress, she had the crown, she had the wand. She had the bed sheets, the lunchbox, the backpack, the shoes that lit up when she walked and played the first 3 notes of Let It Go every time she took a step. She had watched the movie so many times that I could recite the entire script from memory, including the songs, including the parts in Norwegian. I knew every line, every pause, every emotional beat. I had strong opinions about the narrative arc of Frozen 2 that no grown man should ever have to possess. And her 5th birthday was coming up, the big one, the one she had been talking about since her 4th birthday, because when you're a kid, every birthday is the most important day of your life, but 5 is a milestone. 5 means you're practically a teenager in kid years. 5 means you're big, you're grown, you're ready to take on the world. My wife, her name is Sarah, and she is the grounded one in our relationship. She's the voice of reason. The person who looks at a situation and immediately sees the most logical, practical, cost-effective solution, while I'm over here dreaming about ice palaces and magical moments. She's calculating the per-person cost of pizza and wondering if we really need custom invitations when a text message would suffice. So about 3 weeks out, we're sitting at the kitchen table, and Sarah says, okay, we need to figure out Lily's party. I was thinking we order a cake from Costco, maybe get some balloons, and have her friends over for pizza and a movie in the backyard. Simple, easy, she'll love it. And I looked at her. I looked at this beautiful, practical, sensible woman who I had married, and I said, Costco, baby, this is her 5th birthday, her 5th. She only gets one 5th birthday ever in the history of the world. There will only be one day where Lily turns 5. And you want to mark that occasion with? A bulk warehouse cake? Sarah raised an eyebrow, that eyebrow. The one that says I'm about to do something stupid, but she's going to let me do it anyway because she loves me and also because she knows I'll eventually crash and burn and learn my lesson. She said, what did you have in mind? And I swear to you, I don't know where the idea came from. It just appeared in my brain, fully formed, like a lightning bolt of parental insanity. I said, I want to make her an ice sculpture, a life-sized ice sculpture of Elsa with lights inside in our backyard that I carved myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah put down her coffee, she blinked again. Then she said, "You want to carve ice, you a man who once cut himself making toast?" I said, "That was one time and the bread knife was defective." She said, "You want to make a life-sized ice sculpture of a Disney princess for a 5-year-old's birthday party in August?" I said, "Yes, exactly yes." She said, "Do you know anything about ice sculpting?" I said, "Not yet, but I will, I'll learn." People learn things on the internet every day, Sarah. There's YouTube, there's forums, there's probably a subreddit for ice sculpting, I'll figure it out. She looked at me for a long moment, then she sighed, that sigh, the sigh of a woman who has been married to an idiot long enough to know that idiots cannot be stopped. "Only managed," she said. "Fine, but I'm not helping you when this goes wrong, and it's going to go wrong. This is going to be one of those things where I say I told you so, and you pout. And then we both pretend it never happened." I grinned, I actually grinned, because in that moment, I thought I had won. I thought I had secured permission to become the greatest dad in the history of birthday parties. I had no idea. No idea what I was about to unleash upon myself, my family, my garage, and my poor innocent neighbor Gary. That night, after Lily went to sleep, I started my research. And let me tell you something about the internet. The internet is a dangerous place for a man with a dream and a credit card, because the internet will tell you that anything is possible. The internet will show you videos of people building functioning airplanes in their backyards, or carving marble statues with dental tools, or training squirrels to do backflips, and you watch these videos and you think, if they can do that, surely I can freeze some water in a shape, so I fell down the rabbit hole. I watched ice sculpting tutorials until 3 in the morning. I learned about crystal clear ice, which apparently requires a special freezing process where you agitate the water to remove bubbles. I learned about chisels and chainsaws and die grinders. I learned that professional ice sculptors use blocks of ice that weigh 300 pounds and cost $150 each. I learned that there are ice sculpting competitions where people create things so beautiful they belong in museums, and with every video I watched, my confidence grew. Because here's the thing about watching experts do something difficult. When you're watching them and they're making it look effortless, your brain tricks you into thinking it actually is effortless. You see a guy with a chainsaw carve a swan out of ice in 12 minutes, and you think, well, I could do that. It doesn't look that hard, he's just cutting shapes. I cut shapes in my kindergarten class. How different can it be? Very different. It can be very different, but I didn't know that yet. By 2 in the morning, I had a plan. A detailed step-by-step, absolutely foolproof plan. I was going to order a silicone mold, not just any mold, but a custom ice luge mold I found on a party supply website. It was roughly human-shaped, roughly. If you squinted and if you used your imagination, and if you were 5 years old and really wanted to believe, it was about 4 feet tall, which I figured was close enough to life-sized for a kid's party. I was going to fill this mold with water, add blue food coloring to get that magical Elsa dress color, freeze it in layers over the course of 2 weeks, then pop it out and carve the details, the face, the braid, the dress folds. A little smirk, I had sketches, actual sketches on printer paper that looked like they were drawn by someone wearing mittens, but they were sketches nonetheless. Then I found a chest freezer on Facebook Marketplace, $80. $80 for a massive industrial-looking, slightly dented chest freezer that some guy was selling because he was moving to an apartment and didn't have space for it. It was perfect. It was destiny. I messaged the guy at 2:15 in the morning, because that's when responsible adults make major appliance purchases, and I arranged to pick it up the next day. I also bought a chisel set on Amazon. $47.32. It came with 6 different chisels, a mallet, and a carrying case that made me feel like a legitimate craftsman. I bought 3 bottles of blue food coloring, a professional-grade kind that bakeries use, because I wanted that perfect ice blue color, not too dark, not too light, just right, like Elsa's actual dress. I bought LED strip lights, battery-powered, waterproof. Because I had this vision of the ice glowing from within, like she was actually magical, like she had actual ice powers. I bought a tarp to put under the freezer. I bought an extension cord rated for outdoor use. I bought work gloves. I bought safety goggles. I bought a space heater for the garage because I knew I'd be out there late at night and it got cold in the evenings. By the time I checked out, I had spent $212.47. And I felt great about it. I felt like an investor, like a venture capitalist putting money into a guaranteed success. I went to bed that night dreaming of my daughter's face, dreaming of the other parents' reactions, dreaming of the moment when I would pull off the tarp and reveal this masterpiece, and Lily would gasp, and her friends would gasp, and Sarah would look at me with that expression that says, okay, maybe you're not completely useless after all. The next morning, I picked up the freezer. The guy selling it was named Doug. Doug lived in a subdivision about 20 minutes away. Doug was wearing a tank top and flip-flops at 10 in the morning. Doug helped me load the freezer into the back of my Honda CR-V, which was not designed to transport chest freezers, and as we were wedging it in there, Doug looked at me and said, "What you using this for?" And I, with the confidence of a man who had watched 6 hours of YouTube the night before, said, "Ice sculpting." Doug paused, he looked at me, he looked at the freezer, he looked back at me, then he said, "Huh. Good luck with that, man." I should have noticed the way he said it. I should have noticed that it wasn't encouragement, it was condolence. It was the same way you say good luck to someone who's about to try bungee jumping with a homemade cord. But I was too excited, I was too deep in the dream. I got that freezer home, I set it up in the garage, I cleaned it out, because Doug had apparently used it to store fish at some point, and the smell was, well, let's just say it was fragrant. I scrubbed it with bleach and baking soda and lemon juice. I plugged it in. I waited 24 hours for it to reach maximum freezing temperature. I put a thermometer inside to monitor it. I was being scientific, I was being thorough. Then the mold arrived, the silicone mold, and when I took it out of the box, I had my first moment of doubt because this thing was huge. It was much bigger than it looked in the pictures. And the human shape was generous, let's call it generous. It looked less like Elsa and more like a snowman that had been left in the sun for a few minutes and started to slump. But I pushed that doubt down, I told myself. That's why I'm carving it. The mold is just the base. The foundation. Michelangelo didn't just find David lying around in a quarry, right? He had to chip away everything that wasn't David. That's what I was going to do. I was going to chip away everything that wasn't Elsa. I set up my workstation, freezer in the corner, tool bench next to it, tarp on the floor, leadwork light hanging from the ceiling. I put on my gloves. I put on my safety goggles. I looked at myself in the reflection of the freezer lid, and I saw a man ready to create art. Night 1, I filled the bottom section of the mold with water, just the base, about 2 inches. I added 3 drops of blue food coloring. I stirred it with a wooden spoon like I was mixing a potion. I placed the mold inside the freezer. I closed the lid. I set an alarm on my phone for 6 hours later. Because the tutorial said you had to add layers slowly or the ice would crack from thermal stress. I went inside. Sarah was on the couch watching a show. She looked at me, covered in anticipation, smelling faintly of bleach, and she said, "How's the project?" I said. "It's begun." She said, "Please don't wake me up at 3 in the morning with a chainsaw." I said, "I don't have a chainsaw yet." She paused the show. She looked at me. She said, "You're not getting a chainsaw?" I said, "It's fine, I have chisels." She went back to her show. I went to bed. My alarm went off at 2 in the morning. I stumbled out to the garage in my pajamas and slippers. I opened the freezer. The first layer was frozen solid, a perfect, 2-inch thick, blue ice pancake. It looked like a giant hockey puck, and I felt pride, real pride. I had made ice. I had successfully frozen water. I was basically a scientist. I added the second layer, more water, more blue day, a slightly lighter shade this time, because I wanted the dress to have dimension, back into the freezer. Alarm set for another 6 hours. This was my life for the next week. Every 6 hours, around the clock, I was adding layers, 2 in the morning, 8 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 8 in the evening. I was a zombie. I was running on 4 hours of sleep per night. My coworkers noticed. They said I looked tired. I told them I was working on a special project. They assumed I was building a deck or remodeling a bathroom. I didn't correct them. How do you tell your colleagues that you're losing sleep because you're making a frozen princess in your garage? By day 5, the mold was half full and I could start to see the shape emerging. It looked like a blue traffic cone with arms, but it was getting there. The layers were beautiful. The color gradient was actually working. From deep royal blue at the bottom to a lighter sky blue at the top. It looked intentional, it looked artistic. On day 7, I hit a snag, I added a layer, and when I checked it 6 hours later, there was a crack. A hairline fracture running through the middle of the sculpture. I panicked. I googled how to fix cracked ice sculpture at 3 in the morning. I learned that you can fill cracks with slush, a mixture of snow and water, and refreeze it. So I spent 2 hours carefully patching this crack with slush, like a dentist filling a cavity. I checked it every hour, I bobbied it, I talked to it. I'm not ashamed to admit that I named her Elsa at this point. I would open the freezer and say, "How's my girl? You doing okay in there? Almost done, Daddy's almost done." Sarah caught me talking to the freezer once. She was getting something from the garage, a box of old clothes or something. And she heard me. She peeked around the corner. She saw me, kneeling in front of the chest freezer, wearing a headlamp, holding a turkey baster full of blue water, whispering encouragement to a block of ice. She didn't say anything. She just slowly backed away. Later that night, over dinner, she said, "You know it's not actually alive, right?" I said, "It's art, Sarah, you have to respect the process." She said, "The process is making you insane." I said, "Maybe, but it's a good insane." By week 2, the mold was full, the sculpture was complete. In its rough form, it was a solid, 4-foot-tall, 200-pound, blue ice monolith, and it was time for the carving. The actual sculpting, the part where I would transform this lumpy blue cylinder into a recognizable Disney princess. I set up my carving station. I put the sculpture on a wooden platform so I could rotate it. I laid out my chisels, I put on my gloves, my goggles, my apron, I turned on my LED work light, I chose my first chisel, a small V-shaped one for detail work. I placed it against the ice. I tapped the other end with my mallet, and the chip that came off was about the size of a grain of rice. I looked at the sculpture, I looked at the chip, I did the math in my head. At this rate, I would finish sometime around Lily's 15th birthday, so I got more aggressive. I switched to a bigger chisel, I started taking off larger chunks, and slowly, painfully, over the course of several nights, a figure began to emerge. I gave her a neck, I gave her shoulders, I tried to give her the shape of that iconic ice dress, the one with the slit up the side. I carved what I thought was a braid, but it looked more like a frozen snake. I worked on the face for 3 nights straight, and eventually accepted that she was going to have a face like a Picasso painting, abstract, interpretive from a certain angle, in low light, if you really wanted to see it. She looked a little like Elsa, but the dress was actually kind of good. The flowing lines, the way the blue faded from dark to light, the way the ice caught the light when I put the LED strips behind her, just to test. She glowed, she actually glowed, and in that glow, in that magical blue light, all the imperfections disappeared. She looked mystical, she looked like she belonged in an ice palace. I spent the final 3 nights refining, smoothing, polishing with a heat gun, which I learned melts the surface just enough to make it glassy and clear. I added more blue dye to certain areas to create shadows and depth. I built a base out of plywood and painted it white. I planned the reveal, the big moment when I would move her from the garage freezer to the backyard party setup. The night before the heat wave, I stood back in that garage at 1:47 in the morning. Under the flickering fluorescent light, surrounded by ice shavings and empty coffee cups and discarded gloves, and I looked at her, my Elsa, my masterpiece, my 200-pound frozen testament to fatherly love. She was 4 feet tall. She glowed blue from within. She had a braid, sort of. She had a dress. Definitely she had a face that was, well, she had a face, and she was heavy, so heavy. I knew she was 200 pounds because I had weighed the mold before I started. And I had added water in measured amounts. 200 pounds of solid ice. That's like carrying a full-grown adult, but frozen and slippery and very, very fragile. I carefully, so carefully, lifted her. I used a moving blanket as a sling. I had Sarah help me. And by help me, I mean she stood nearby and said things like, be careful and don't drop it, and if you herniate a disc, I'm not taking you to the emergency room. We lifted her together. We moved her the 6 feet from the work platform to the chest freezer. We lowered her inside. She fit, barely. The freezer was deep enough that she cleared the lid by about 3 inches. I plugged the freezer into a dedicated outlet. I set the temperature dial to maximum cold. I added extra insulation around the lid. I said goodnight to her. I closed the garage door. I went to bed and slept the sleep of a man who has just completed a masterpiece. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing, not my alarm, a notification, multiple notifications, weather alerts. I squinted at the screen, heat advisory, excessive heat warning. Temperatures expected to reach 102 degrees, heat index of 110. The power grid was under extreme stress. Residents were advised to limit electricity usage. Rolling blackouts were possible. I looked out the window. It was already hot. The kind of hot where the air shimmers above the pavement. The kind of hot where you open your front door and it feels like someone is blow-drying your face. But I wasn't worried, not really. Freezers are designed to keep things cold. That's literally their entire purpose. And this freezer was running at maximum power. It was in the garage, which was insulated. Yes, it was hot outside, but freezers deal with heat all the time. People in Arizona have freezers. People in Phoenix have chest freezers in their garages and they work fine. This would be fine. I made coffee. I kissed Sarah goodbye. I hugged Lily and told her that Daddy had a very special surprise for her birthday party. She squealed, she jumped up and down. She sang Let It Go at maximum volume while eating her cereal. I left for work feeling like a king, like a legend, like the kind of dad that other dads would tell stories about. The office was freezing, corporate air conditioning blasting at 68 degrees. I sat at my desk. I answered emails. I worked on spreadsheets. I checked my phone every 20 minutes to see the temperature climbing. 85 degrees by 10 in the morning, 92 by noon, 97 by 1 o'clock. The weather app showed a little sun icon that looked angry. That sun looked like it wanted to hurt someone at around 12:30. Sarah texted me, she said. Power went out for about 10 minutes, just came back on. Everything okay at work? I texted back. Yeah, everything's fine here. Did the freezer seem okay? She said. I didn't check. I was in the shower when it happened, but it's back on now. I'm sure it's fine. I was sure it was fine too. 10 minutes? What could happen in 10 minutes? The freezer was full of frozen mass. 200 pounds of ice plus the frozen walls of the freezer itself. 10 minutes without power was nothing. It would be like putting an ice cube in a warm room for 10 minutes. It wouldn't even start sweating. Everything was fine. I went back to work. I had a meeting at 2. A budget review, very boring, very long. I sat in a conference room with no windows and listened to people talk about quarterly projections while my mind wandered to the party. I was thinking about the setup, the table, the lights, the moment of the reveal. I was thinking about how I would get 6 guys to help me carry the sculpture from the garage to the backyard. I was thinking about whether I should rent a fog machine. Fog would be cool, very atmospheric, very frozen. The meeting ended at 3:30. I checked my phone, more weather alerts. The temperature had hit 101 degrees. The power grid was now at critical levels. The utility company was asking people to turn off non-essential appliances. I looked at the alerts, and I felt the first tiny flicker of concern, just a flicker. Like a candle in a drafty room, I texted Sarah. Maybe unplug the TV and stuff, save power for the freezer? She texted back. Already done, stop worrying, it's a freezer, it's fine. I tried to stop worrying, I really did. But that flicker of concern had taken hold. It was growing. By 4 o'clock, I was having trouble concentrating. By 4:30, I was checking the weather app every 5 minutes. By 5, I was packing up my desk. By 5:15, I was in my car, driving home in 100-degree heat, with the air conditioning blasting, telling myself that everything was fine, that freezers are built for this. That 200 pounds of ice doesn't just disappear in a few hours. But here's the thing about anxiety. Anxiety doesn't listen to logic. Anxiety listens to worst-case scenarios. And my worst-case scenario was playing on a loop in my head. What if the power went out again? What if it was out longer this time? What if the freezer couldn't handle the heat? What if the ice started to melt? What if it cracked? What if the blue dye leaked everywhere? What if I opened that freezer and found 200 pounds of water instead of art? I pulled into my driveway at 5:42. The sun was still high and angry. The asphalt was radiating heat like a stovetop. I could feel the warmth through my shoes as I walked to the garage door. I pressed the button. The garage door rumbled open, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, not a bad smell. Not a rotten smell, but a wet smell. A dense, humid, cave-like smell, the smell of water that has been sitting in a warm, dark place, the smell of a basement after a flood, the smell of melting. My stomach dropped. It didn't just drop. It fell, it plummeted, it went into freefall. I stepped into the garage, the lights were off. I flipped the switch, the fluorescent light buzzed to life, flickering, casting that weird industrial glow over everything, and I saw it. I saw the chest freezer, and I saw the puddle, not a big puddle, not yet, but a puddle, a thin sheet of water spreading out from the base of the freezer, water that had seeped out from under the lid. Water that was making its way across the concrete floor, toward the kitchen door, toward the boxes of old clothes, toward the lawnmower, and then I heard it, drip, 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 that sound. That terrible, rhythmic, inevitable sound of water falling from a height. It was coming from inside the freezer, from under the lid. I ran to that freezer like my life depended on it. I threw open the lid, and what I saw in that moment, is something that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. She was still there, my Elsa, my ice queen, but she was not standing tall and proud, she was slumped. Leaning hard to one side like she had given up on life, like she had just received terrible news and couldn't bear to stand anymore. Her head was tilted at an angle that made her look like she was questioning every decision she had ever made. Her braid, my carefully carved braid, had separated from her head and was now just a blue icicle hanging by a thread, but the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the bottom third, the base, the foundation. The part that had been sitting on the freezer floor. It had melted, just enough to turn from solid ice into a sticky, stubborn, welded to the metal slush that had then refrozen when the power came back on. She was fused. Fused to the floor of the chest freezer, like someone had glued her there, like she had grown out of the metal itself, and because the top had melted and slumped while the bottom stayed frozen in place. She was now locked in this grotesque position, a position that no human spine could ever achieve. She looked like Elsa after a very intense yoga session, or like Elsa if she had been in a car accident. It was tragic, it was horrifying. It was melting, water was pooling around her base. Blue water, not just water, but bright, concentrated, food dye blue water, the kind of blue that stains everything it touches. The pool was getting deeper, the freezer's drain hole, which was designed to let out condensation, was completely blocked by the fused base of the sculpture. The water had nowhere to go, so it was rising, slowly but surely, it was rising, and the freezer itself. My poor, overworked $80 Facebook Marketplace freezer was running nonstop. The motor was groaning, the compressor was shaking, it was working harder than it had ever worked in its entire existence. Trying to freeze 200 pounds of melting ice in a garage that was currently 105 degrees, and it was losing. I could feel it losing. The air coming out of the vents was cool, but not cold enough. I stood there, I stared at this disaster, and I felt something break inside me, not physically, emotionally, spiritually, the kind of break where you realize that everything you have worked for, every sleepless night, every frozen finger, every dollar spent, every dream you had, is currently turning into a blue puddle in your garage. I checked my watch, 5:48. Sarah had texted me earlier. She was picking up Lily from her mom's house. They would be home in approximately 45 minutes. 45 minutes until my wife, who had predicted this exact disaster, would walk into this garage and see what I had done. 45 minutes until my daughter, who thought her dad was making her a magical surprise, would be old enough to understand that sometimes dads fail spectacularly, and the water was spreading. It was no longer just under the freezer, it was reaching the edges of the tarp. It was seeping into the concrete, it was heading toward the kitchen door. If I didn't do something, and fast, we wouldn't just have a ruined sculpture, we would have a flooded garage, a flooded kitchen, blue-stained floors, water damage, mold. Thousands of dollars in repairs. I grabbed a bucket. I started bailing water out of the freezer, but the bucket was too big to fit around the sculpture, and every time I moved water, more melted to take its place. It was like trying to empty a bathtub with a thimble while the faucet was still running. I grabbed towels. I started mopping up the floor, but the towels soaked through in seconds. The water was too much, too fast, too blue. I grabbed the hairdryer from the bathroom. I thought, I'll melt the base just enough to loosen her, then I can lift her out, then I can deal with the water. Genius, right? I plugged in the hairdryer, set it to high, and started blasting the base of the sculpture. Do you know what happens when you point a hairdryer at 200 pounds of ice in a 100-degree garage? Nothing, absolutely nothing. The hairdryer was like a mosquito trying to warm up a glacier. I spent 20 minutes, 20 precious minutes, blasting that ice, and all I accomplished was making the garage so humid that my glasses fogged up and I couldn't see. The ice didn't budge, not a millimeter, but my electricity bill was probably increasing by the second. I tried a hammer, a regular claw hammer from my tool bench. I thought, I'll chip away the base, I'll break the fused part, I'll free her. I tapped gently, nothing. I tapped harder, a tiny chip flew off. I hit it with real force. The hammer bounced back, the vibration shot up my arm and made my elbow go numb, and the noise of metal hitting ice in an enclosed garage was like a gunshot. I was definitely going to give Gary a heart attack if I kept this up. I looked at the time, 6:05, 30 minutes left. 30 minutes until Sarah and Lily came home. 30 minutes to somehow extract a 200-pound fused ice sculpture from a failing chest freezer, bail out 50 gallons of blue water, clean up the garage, and pretend like everything was fine. And that's when I saw him, Gary, my neighbor, retired cop Gary. He was in his front yard, watering his tomato plants. He was wearing his usual outfit, cargo shorts, white New Balance sneakers, a fishing hat. He was humming something. He looked peaceful, he looked competent, he looked like a man who knew how to solve problems. And I thought, Gary will know what to do. Gary was a cop. He's seen everything, he's dealt with emergencies, he probably knows how to move heavy objects, he has a truck, he has tools, he has life experience. Gary is the answer. I didn't think about how I would phrase the question. I didn't rehearse it, I just ran. I ran out of the garage, across the driveway, through the front yard, still wearing my work clothes which were now soaked with sweat and blue water, my hands stained bright blue from the food coloring, my hair sticking up in every direction, my eyes probably looking like I hadn't slept in a week. Gary saw me coming, he turned off his hose, he set it down, he watched me approach with this look of mild concern. Like he was wondering if he should go inside and lock the door. I stopped in front of him, I was breathing hard, I was panicking, and I opened my mouth, and out came the words that would change my life. Gary, I need your help. How do I dispose of a 200-pound solid lump before it turns into liquid? The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever heard. It was a silence with weight, a silence with history. A silence that seemed to stretch out for hours, days, years. Gary's face went through a transformation. It was like watching a nature documentary in slow motion. First, confusion, his eyebrows knitted together, his mouth opened slightly. Then, realization, a dark, terrible realization dawned in his eyes. His gaze dropped to my hands, which were covered in blue stains that looked, in the right light, like they could be something else entirely. His eyes moved to my shirt, which was wet and clinging to my body, then to my face, which was pale and sweaty and wild-eyed, and then, suspicion, deep, bone-deep suspicion. The kind of suspicion that comes from 20 years of listening to people lie. Of hearing every excuse, every story, every desperate attempt to explain away the unexplainable, he took a step back, just one, but it was a meaningful step, a step that put distance between us, his right hand. That hand that had twitched toward his pocket earlier, now definitely went into his pocket, and I just knew, he was grabbing his phone. He said, very slowly, very carefully, "Excuse me," and I, in my infinite wisdom, doubled down. I said, "Yeah, man, it's stuck in my freezer, fused to the floor, and it's melting fast. If I don't get rid of it in the next few hours, my entire kitchen is gonna be underwater, and there's blue dye everywhere." I watched Gary's brain process this information. I could practically see the gears turning, and I could see that his gears were turning in a very specific direction. A direction that involved crime scene tape and forensic investigators. He said, "Your freezer?" I said, "Yeah, my chest freezer in the garage." He said, "And there's blue dye." I said, "So much blue dye, Gary, it's everywhere. The water is bright blue, it's seeping under the door. I need to get it out of there before my wife gets home. Can you help me? We need to carry it somewhere, dump it before it becomes a puddle." Gary's face had gone completely neutral. That cop face, that blank, unreadable mask that they teach you in the academy. He glanced at my garage, then back at me, then at my hands again, and he said, "Son, what did you do?" And I said, "I didn't do anything, I mean. I did something, I made something, but now it's stuck and it's melting and I just need to get rid of it. Can you help me carry it, please?" Gary took another step back. He looked at my garage door, which was still open. He could probably see the freezer from where he stood. He could probably see the blue water on the floor. He could definitely see the panic in my eyes, and then he asked the question. The question that should have made me realize exactly how this sounded. He said, Is there someone in the freezer?" I laughed. I actually laughed. It was a high-pitched, nervous, absolutely unhinged laugh. I said, "What? No, Gary, no. It's ice. It's an ice sculpture for my daughter. She's turning 5. It's Elsa from Frozen, you know, let it go." But Gary wasn't laughing. Gary wasn't convinced, because at that exact moment, at the worst possible moment in the history of bad timing, my wife's car pulled into the driveway. Sarah was home. She was back from her mom's house, and Lily, my sweet, innocent, Frozen-obsessed Lily, was in the back seat. Probably wearing her Elsa dress, probably excited to see Daddy, probably wondering what special surprise he had been working on. Sarah got out of the car. She was holding Lily's hand. She was wearing sunglasses and a summer dress. She looked happy, relaxed. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea that her husband was currently standing in the front yard, covered in blue dye, having what appeared to be a very intense conversation with their neighbor about disposing of a 200-pound solid lump. She walked toward us. Lily ran ahead, her little Elsa dress sparkling in the sun, her plastic tiara slightly crooked on her head. She ran up to me and hugged my leg. She said, "Hi, Daddy. Did you make my surprise?" I looked down at my daughter. I looked at Sarah, who had stopped walking and was now staring at me with an expression that I can only describe as concerned confusion. I looked at Gary, who was still gripping his phone in his pocket, still looking at me like I was a suspect in an episode of Dateline, and I realized, in that moment, that I had about 10 seconds to explain myself before this situation went from embarrassing to catastrophic. 10 seconds to convince a retired cop that I wasn't a criminal, 10 seconds to convince my wife that I hadn't lost my mind, 10 seconds to save my daughter's birthday, and possibly my marriage, and definitely my freedom. I took a deep breath. I spread my arms wide, my blue-stained hands gleaming in the evening sun, and I said, "Okay, everyone, just hear me out." I said those words, standing in my driveway with my daughter hugging my leg, my wife staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult, and my retired cop neighbor slowly reaching for what I was 90% sure was either his phone or a concealed weapon he definitely shouldn't have had anymore. The sun was beating down, 102 degrees, my shirt was see-through with sweat, my hands were stained bright blue, and I had exactly one shot to explain myself before Gary called in a SWAT team and Sarah filed for divorce. I looked at Gary first. I said, "Gary, I need you to come with me to the garage. Just look, 30 seconds. If you still think I'm a serial killer after 30 seconds, you can call whoever you want, but please. Just look." Gary didn't move, not at first. He looked at Sarah, and Sarah, bless her heart, she looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes. It wasn't trust exactly. It was more like exhausted familiarity. Like she had seen me do enough stupid things over the years that she knew. She just knew. This wasn't a body in the freezer. It was something much dumber. She said, "Gary, just go look. I promise you, whatever's in that garage. It's not what you're thinking." Gary hesitated. Then he nodded one sharp nod. He said, "Lead the way." So I led. I walked across the driveway, Lily still holding my hand, Sarah following behind. Gary bringing up the rear with his hand still hovering near his pocket. We entered the garage. I flipped on the light, and the full horror of the situation was revealed in flickering fluorescent glory. The chest freezer, the open lid, the blue water spreading across the floor like a toxic spill, the chunks of ice scattered everywhere, the half-melted, lopsided, vaguely human-shaped blue monolith fused to the freezer floor, the hairdryer still plugged in and dangling over the side like some kind of medical instrument, the hammer on the ground, the towels soaked through and stained blue. The overall scene looked less like a birthday prep and more like a meth lab that had been hit by a hurricane. Gary stopped in the doorway. He took it all in. His eyes moved from the freezer to the water to the ice chunks to the sculpture itself, and then he laughed, not a little chuckle, not a polite laugh. A full, deep from-the-belly laugh that echoed off the garage walls. He laughed so hard he had to lean against my workbench. He laughed so hard his fishing hat fell off. He pointed at the sculpture, at the slumped, melted, Picasso-faced ice queen, and he said, "You made a giant frozen princess in your garage for a birthday party?" I nodded, miserable, defeated, blue-handed. I said, "Yeah, that was the plan." Gary wiped his eyes. He was still laughing. He said, "And you asked me how to dispose of a 200-pound solid lump?" I said. I panicked. "Gary, the power went out. It's melting. My wife was about to come home." I didn't think about how it sounded. Gary walked over to the freezer, he peered inside, he poked the sculpture with one finger, he said, "She's stuck all right, fused right to the floor, and she's leaning pretty hard there, buddy. She looks like she's had a rough night." I said, "I know, I tried a hair dryer, I tried a hammer, I tried bailing water, nothing works, it's melting faster than I can fix it. The party is tomorrow morning, Gary. At 10 a.m. I have 16 hours to somehow get this thing out of here, fix it, and set it up in the backyard, it's impossible." Gary scratched his chin, he looked at the sculpture again, he looked at the freezer. Then he looked at me and said, "My brother's got a landscaping company, he's got a flatbed truck with a winch, and I know a guy from my bowling league, who does ice sculptures for weddings and corporate events. Real professional stuff, let me make some calls." I stared at him, I literally stared at him, I said, "You do that?" Gary shrugged, he said, "I've been retired 3 years of watering tomatoes and watching cable news. This is the most interesting thing that's happened on this block since the Henderson kid got his head stuck in the porch railing in 2019. Besides, I want to see how this ends." Sarah stepped forward. She had been quiet this whole time, just taking in the disaster. She said, "How much is this going to cost?" Gary said, "The truck and winch, my brother owes me a favor, he'll do it for a case of beer, the ice sculptor, that guy. His name's Tony, he's a character, he'll probably charge you something, but he'll also probably fix this mess." I looked at Sarah, she looked at the garage, she looked at the blue water inching toward her boxes of winter clothes, she sighed. That sigh, the same sigh from 3 weeks ago when I announced this project, she said, "Call everyone, but if this costs more than $300, you're sleeping in this garage until Christmas." I called Gary's brother first. His name was Mike. Mike answered on the third ring, and Gary explained the situation, and I could hear Mike laughing through the phone from 6 feet away, but he said he'd be there in an hour. He said he had a reciprocating saw and a winch and straps, he said, and I quote, "I gotta see this frozen princess for myself." Then Gary called Tony, the ice sculptor. Tony was apparently at a bowling league match when Gary called. I could hear the clatter of pins in the background, Gary explained, and there was a long pause, and then Tony said something that made Gary's eyebrows go up. Gary hung up and said, "Tony says he'll come take a look, but he wants to know," and this is a direct quote, "does it have to be Elsa or can we pivot to abstract?" I said, "It has to be Elsa, my daughter is 5. She will accept nothing less than Elsa." Gary relayed this information, more bowling noises, then Gary said, "Tony says he'll be here in 45 minutes, and he says to stop touching it. He says amateurs make it worse." I felt a strange mix of relief and insult. I was being rescued, but I was also being called an amateur, which, fair, I was absolutely an amateur. I had proven that beyond any doubt. Lily, who had been remarkably quiet during all of this, tugged on my shirt. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes and she said, "Daddy, is my surprise broken?" I knelt down, my knees cracked. "I was too old for this," I said. "No, baby, it's not broken, it's just resting. Daddy's friends are going to help make it even better. You're going to have the best birthday ever, I promise." She thought about this, then she said, "Can I see it?" I looked at the sculpture. The slumped, melting, half-destroyed ice lump. I said, "How about tomorrow at the party? It'll be a surprise." She nodded, she accepted this. She said, "Okay, but it better be good. Because Jessica's dad got her a pony for her birthday." A pony? Jessica's dad got her a pony, and I was over here destroying my garage for a melting ice sculpture. The parental competition was real, and I was losing. Sarah took Lily inside to get her dinner and ready for bed. I stayed in the garage with Gary. We started bailing water, just the two of us, using buckets and towels, trying to keep the flood at bay until reinforcements arrived. Gary told me stories from his cop days. He told me about the time they found a guy trying to dispose of a stolen ATM by burying it in his backyard. He told me about a lady who called 911 because her neighbor was suspiciously digging holes at night. And it turned out the neighbor was just installing a koi pond. He said, "You know what the difference is between a criminal and an idiot?" I said, "What?" He said, "The criminal tries to hide what he's doing. The idiot tells everyone about it." You told your neighbor, a cop, that you needed to dispose of a 200-pound lump. That's idiot behavior, not criminal behavior. I knew you weren't a killer the second you said it. A killer would have been subtle. You were just panicking. I said, "So you weren't actually going to call the police?" He grinned. He said, "Oh, I was absolutely going to call, but I would have asked for a wellness check, not a SWAT team. I thought you were having a stroke or something." Mike arrived first. He pulled up in a massive white landscaping truck, the kind with dual rear wheels and a flatbed and a winch that looked like it could pull a tree stump out of the ground. Mike was bigger than Gary, taller, whiter. He had a beard that reached his chest and arms like tree trunks. He walked into my garage, took one look at the freezer, and said, "Holy hell. You really did make a giant ice lady?" I said, "Yeah, that's Elsa." Mike walked around the freezer. He inspected it like he was appraising a used car. He said, "She's fused to the floor, no way you're lifting her out. You'd have to tip the whole freezer and dump it, but it's too heavy, 200 pounds of ice plus the freezer itself, that's 400 pounds easy, and if we tip it, she'll shatter," I said. "So what do we do?" Mike opened his truck. He pulled out a reciprocating saw, a big one, industrial, he said. "We cut the freezer, we cut it right down the middle like a clamshell, we open it up, slide some straps under her, and winch her onto the truck bed, then we take her to Tony's place. He said he's got a walk-in freezer there, we can store her overnight while he fixes her up." Cut the freezer, my $80 Facebook Marketplace freezer. The one I had scrubbed and bleached and loved like a child. We were going to cut it in half. I looked at Sarah, who had come back out to check on the progress. She shrugged, she said, "It was $80, cut it." So Mike started cutting. And let me tell you, watching a man cut a chest freezer in half with a reciprocating saw is something else. The noise was incredible, sparks flew, metal screeched. The smell of burning paint filled the garage. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of the most violent, aggressive appliance surgery I had ever witnessed. And when he was done, when he pried those two halves apart like opening a giant metal oyster, there she was, my Elsa, exposed. fused to the freezer floor, which was now just a metal tray sitting on the garage concrete, but she was still stuck. The bottom of the ice was welded to that metal tray. Mike tried prying it with a crowbar, no luck, Tony. The ice sculptor arrived just as Mike was about to start wailing on it with a sledgehammer. Tony was not what I expected. I expected a big guy, a burly guy, a guy who looked like he swung chainsaws for a living. Tony was 5'6", maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. He had a goatee. He was wearing a bowling shirt with his name embroidered on it. He looked like he should be managing a comic book store, not carving ice for weddings. But Tony knew his stuff. He walked into the garage, took one look at the sculpture, and he didn't laugh. He assessed, he walked around it, he touched the ice, he looked at the cracks, he looked at the fused base, he looked at the slumped posture. And he said, okay, here's the situation. The base is fused because it melted and refroze. The internal structure is compromised. There are stress fractures running through the midsection. The face is abstract and the braid is detached. But the color gradient is actually decent. Who did the layering? I raised my hand like a kid in class. I said, me, I watched YouTube. Tony nodded. He said, not bad for a first-timer, but this isn't salvageable as is. I can fix it, but I need to take it back to my shop. I need to put it in my walk-in freezer. I need to chip away the damaged parts and recarve the face and the details. I need to reattach the braid properly. And I need to build a proper base with drainage so it doesn't just sit in a puddle. I said, how much? Tony looked at the sculpture. He looked at me. He looked at Sarah. Then he said, $250. Plus materials, plus I keep the silicone mold. I've been looking for a mold this size for a project. You give me the mold. I give you a professional grade Elsa ice sculpture. Deal, $250. Plus the $212 I had already spent. Plus the $80 for the destroyed freezer, plus the case of beer for Mike. We were looking at close to $600 for a birthday decoration. I looked at Sarah. She was doing that thing where she calculates the cost in her head and converts it into practical things we could have bought instead. $600 was groceries for a month. It was 2 car payments. It was a weekend getaway. But then Lily appeared in the doorway. She was in her pajamas. She was holding her stuffed Olaf. She said, Daddy, are you fixing my surprise? And I looked at her and I looked at Tony and I said, deal, do it. Make her perfect. Tony nodded. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Within 30 minutes. There were 6 grown men in my garage, Mike and his winch, Gary directing traffic, Tony with his professional tools. 2 of Tony's assistants who had shown up with a refrigerated van, and me, standing in the corner, covered in blue dye, holding a shop towel, watching them work. They strapped the sculpture, they attached the winch, they lifted her. Metal tray and all, onto the flatbed truck. The ice groaned, it cracked in a few places. Tony filled the cracks with slush as they moved. They covered her with insulated blankets, they secured her with ratchet straps. It was like watching a military operation. A very weird, very specific military operation dedicated to saving a Disney princess made of frozen water. As they were about to drive away, Tony turned to me and said, I'll have her ready by 6 a.m. I'll deliver her myself. Setup starts at 8, parties at 10, we'll make it. I said, thank you, seriously, thank you. Tony shrugged. He said, I got a daughter too, she's 12 now. But when she was 5, I would have moved mountains for her. This is just ice, easy. They drove off. The garage was empty, well, empty of the sculpture. It was still full of blue water and metal shards and the 2 halves of a destroyed chest freezer. Sarah handed me a mop, she said, clean this up, then come inside and eat something. You look like you're about to pass out. I mopped, I swept, I threw away the ruined towels, I dragged the freezer carcass to the curb for bulk pickup. By 10 o'clock, the garage looked almost normal, just a faint blue stain on the concrete that would probably be there until we sold the house. I went inside. Sarah had made sandwiches. I ate 2 of them without tasting them. I drank 3 glasses of water. I sat on the couch, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt something other than panic. I felt hope. It was small, it was fragile, but it was there. Sarah sat next to me. She didn't say anything for a while, then she said, you know, when you first told me about this idea, I thought it was stupid. I thought you were being ridiculous. I thought you were trying to compete with Instagram parents and it was going to end in disaster. I said. It kind of did end in disaster. She smiled. She said, but you know what? Lily is going to remember this, not the part where you panicked, not the part where you destroyed a freezer. She's going to remember that her dad cared enough to try something impossible, and she's going to remember that when things went wrong, you didn't give up, you found a way, that's what matters. I looked at her, I said, does this mean you're not mad about the $600? She laughed, she said, oh, I'm furious about the $600. You're doing dishes for the next 3 months, but I'm not mad at you, I'm mad with you. There's a difference. I slept that night. I actually slept deep, dreamless, exhausted sleep. My alarm went off at 5:30. I woke up in the dark. The house was quiet. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the street. Waiting at 6:15, Tony's van pulled up. He got out, he opened the back doors, and he and his 2 assistants carefully, so carefully, wheeled out a dolly. On that dolly, under a white sheet, was my sculpture, my Elsa. But different, transformed, they brought her into the backyard. Tony pulled off the sheet and I gasped. I actually gasped out loud. She was 5 feet tall, not 4'5". Tony had added to her. He had used my original sculpture as a base, but he had carved new ice and attached it seamlessly. The face was perfect. It was actually Elsa. The eyes, the nose, the little smirk, the braid was intricate. Individual strands of ice woven together, the dress flowed like fabric caught in a frozen wind, and inside, embedded in the ice, were lead strips that glowed a soft, magical blue. Not the harsh, artificial blue of food coloring, but a gentle, ethereal glow that made her look like she was actually radiating ice magic. Tony had built a proper base, a white pedestal with a drainage system. Hidden tubes that would carry meltwater away as she slowly melted during the party. He had even added small details I hadn't thought of. Snowflakes carved into the base, tiny ice crystals around her feet. It was a work of art. A genuine, professional, museum-quality work of art, I said. Tony, this is incredible. Tony was sweating. It was already 80 degrees at 6 in the morning, he said. She'll last about 4 hours in this heat. Maybe 5 if we keep her in the shade. The drainage will handle the melt, but after that, she's going to be a puddle. That's just physics. You can't fight physics. I said. 4 hours is perfect. The party's 2 hours. She just needs to make it through the reveal. We set up the backyard. Sarah helped. We put Elsa on a raised platform draped in white linen. We hung twinkle lights in the trees. We set up tables with Frozen-themed plates and cups. We inflated balloons. We hung a banner that said Happy 5th Birthday Lily in glittery letters by 8:30. It looked like a Pinterest board had come to life. At 9, Lily woke up. She came downstairs in her Elsa pajamas. Her hair was messy, her eyes were still puffy with sleep. She walked into the kitchen, looked out the window at the backyard, and she froze. She saw the setup, the lights, the platform, the white sheet covering something tall and magical. She turned to me. She didn't say anything. She just pointed. I knelt down. I said, "You want to see your surprise?" She nodded, fast, excited. Her whole body was vibrating. I took her hand. I led her outside. Sarah followed with her phone, recording. The morning sun was bright. The air was already warm, but in the shade of our oak tree, under the twinkle lights, with the fog machine I had rented at the last minute pumping gentle white mist across the lawn. It looked like a scene from a movie. I walked Lily to the platform. I said, "Close your eyes." She squeezed them shut. She was bouncing on her toes. I reached up. I grabbed the white sheet, and I pulled. The sheet fell away. The LED lights inside the ice caught the morning sun and scattered it into 1,000 blue rainbows. The fog machine swirled around the base. And there she was, Elsa, 5 feet tall, glowing, magical, perfect. Lily opened her eyes. And the sound she made, I can't even describe it. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a gasp, it was this, pure, unfiltered joy, this sound that only a 5-year-old can make when they see magic. She put both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were the size of dinner plates. She whispered, "Daddy, you made this." I looked at Tony, who was standing by the fence, watching. I looked at Sarah, who was crying a little. I looked at my daughter, who was looking at me like I was the most powerful, most wonderful, most magical person in the entire universe. And I said, "Yeah, baby, Daddy made this with a lot of help from some very nice friends." She ran to the sculpture. She hugged it, which, not the best idea, because it was freezing cold and she was in pajamas, but she didn't care. She pressed her cheek against the ice. She said, "She's real. She's really real." The other kids started arriving at 9:30. Jessica, the one whose dad got her a pony, was the first to show up. She walked into the backyard, saw the sculpture, and her jaw dropped. She said, "Lily, your dad made that?" Lily nodded proudly. She said, "My daddy made Elsa out of ice with his hands." Jessica looked at me. She looked at the sculpture, and I saw something in her eyes. It wasn't jealousy exactly, it was awe. She said, "That's cooler than a pony." And I swear, in that moment, I felt like I had won. I felt like I had climbed Mount Everest, like I had run a marathon, like I had achieved something that no spreadsheet or budget report could ever match. The parents started arriving. They walked into the backyard, and every single one of them stopped and stared. They asked where I rented it from. They asked how much it cost. They asked if I was secretly an artist. I just smiled and said, "It's custom, one of a kind." Sarah had ordered the Costco cake after all because Sarah is smart, and the cake was great, but nobody was looking at the cake. Everyone was looking at Elsa. The kids were taking pictures with her. The parents were taking pictures of the kids taking pictures with her. Someone put a party hat on her head, which looked ridiculous and perfect at the same time. Tony stuck around for a while. He was enjoying the attention. Parents were asking him for his business card. He handed them out like candy. He told them about his wedding sculptures, his corporate events, his ice bars. He was networking at a 5-year-old's birthday party. And he was loving every second of it. Gary showed up too. He brought his wife. They brought a gift for Lily, a Frozen coloring book. Gary stood by the fence with a beer, watching the chaos, and he caught my eye. He raised his beer. I raised my plastic cup of lemonade. We nodded at each other. An understanding passed between us. A bond forged in the fires of freezer destruction and blue dye panic. By 10:30, the temperature had climbed to 90 degrees. By 11, it was 95. The sculpture, my beautiful, perfect, glowing Elsa, started to show signs of distress. The first thing to go was the braid, the intricate woven braid that Tony had spent hours carving. It started to soften. The individual strands began to merge. By 11:15, the braid looked more like a frozen ponytail. By 11:30, it was just a lump on the side of her head. The kids didn't notice. They were too busy hitting a piñata and eating cake and running through the sprinkler. But I noticed. I was standing by the sculpture like a nervous bodyguard, watching every drip, every softening edge, every millimeter of melt. The face started to go around noon. The sharp details, the eyes, the nose, the smirk, they began to round off. She started to look like Elsa if Elsa had been stung by a bee. The dress was still mostly intact, but the flowing folds were becoming smooth. The snowflakes at the base were disappearing into puddles, but the LED lights kept glowing, and in the bright afternoon sun, with the fog machine still churning out mist, the melting sculpture looked almost more magical than the perfect one, like she was actually using her powers, like she was transforming, like the ice was alive. At 12:30, Jessica's mom approached me. She said, "This is incredible, seriously, I've never seen anything like this at a kid's party. How long did it take you?" I said, 3 weeks and about $600 and one destroyed chest freezer. And my neighbor thought I was disposing of a body. She laughed. She thought I was joking. I didn't correct her. By 1 o'clock, the party was winding down. Kids were leaving with goodie bags. Parents were thanking us. Lily was running around in her Elsa dress, her face covered in blue frosting, happier than I had ever seen her. She hugged me 17 times. She said thank you 23 times. She told me I was the best daddy in the world. She told me she wanted to be an ice sculptor when she grew up. She told me she was going to marry Olaf, and through it all, Elsa melted. She melted with dignity. She melted with grace. By 1:30, she was about 3 feet tall. The LED lights were now sticking out of the ice like little birthday candles. The dress had become a puddle with a torso sticking out of it. The face was completely gone, just a smooth blue oval, but Lily didn't care. When the last guest left, when it was just our family in the backyard, Lily walked up to the remains of the sculpture. She put her hand on what was left of the ice. She said, "Bye-bye, Elsa, thank you for coming to my party." And then she reached into the puddle at the base. She pulled something out, a small piece of ice, about the size of a golf ball. It was blue, deep blue, the color of the original layers I had poured 3 weeks ago. She held it up to the sun. It glowed. She looked at me. She said, "Can I keep this?" I said, "Of course, baby, that's yours." She ran inside. I heard the freezer door open. I heard her rummaging around when I went inside later. I found a Ziploc bag in the kitchen freezer. Inside was the blue ice ball. She had wrapped it in a paper towel. She had labeled it with a crayon drawing of Elsa. She had written, in her wobbly 5-year-old handwriting, "Daddy's magic ice. Do not throw away." I stood there. I looked at that Ziploc bag and I felt something crack inside me. Not a bad crack, a good crack, like ice shifting on a frozen lake, like something deep and frozen finally melting into something warm. Sarah came up behind me. She wrapped her arms around my waist. She rested her chin on my shoulder. She looked at the freezer. She said, "She's going to remember this forever. You know that, right? Not the sculpture, not the party. The fact that you tried, the fact that you cared enough to be ridiculous." I said, "Was it worth $600? She squeezed me. She said, "Ask me again in 20 years when she's showing her kids pictures of her 5th birthday. When she tells them about the time her dad made a giant ice princess in the garage. When she talks about how her dad was willing to look like a complete idiot just to make her smile. Ask me then." I turned around. I hugged her. I said, "I'm sorry about the freezer." She laughed. She said, "I'm sorry I doubted you a little bit. I'm still mostly not sorry." We stood there, the three of us, me, Sarah, and a Ziploc bag of magic ice. The backyard was quiet. The fog machine had run out of juice. The twinkle lights were still on, little white stars in the afternoon sun, and somewhere outside, Gary was probably watering his tomatoes, laughing to himself about the time his neighbor almost got arrested for making a birthday decoration. But here's the thing, here's the part that nobody saw coming, the twist, the kicker. The moment that turned this whole ridiculous disaster into something I'll never forget, because 3 days after the party, I was cleaning out the garage, final cleanup, getting rid of the last blue stains, sweeping up the last ice chips. And I found something under my workbench, in the corner where I had done all my late-night carving, was a piece of paper folded up small like a note. I picked it up, I opened it, and my heart stopped. It was a drawing, a crayon drawing. Of me wearing my safety goggles and my apron, holding a chisel, standing next to a giant blue princess, and underneath, in Lily's wobbly handwriting, were the words, "My daddy is an ice artist, he made Elsa for me. He is the best daddy in the whole world. I love him to the moon and back, and to Elsa's castle and back." And taped to the back of the drawing was a photograph, a Polaroid. I don't know when she took it, I don't know how. But it was a picture of me, asleep in the garage chair at 3 in the morning, my head tilted back, my mouth open, my hands still stained blue, surrounded by ice shavings. She had taken a picture of me, she had seen me. All those nights when I thought she was asleep, she had snuck out, she had watched me, she had seen every exhausted, ridiculous, determined moment, she had seen me fail, she had seen me struggle. She had seen me at my most ridiculous, and she had loved me anyway, more maybe because of it. I sat down on the garage floor, I held that drawing, I held that picture, and I cried, not sad crying, the other kind. The kind that comes when you realize that your kid sees you, really sees you, not the Instagram version, not the finished product, the messy, tired, trying so hard version, and she thinks that version is worth drawing, worth photographing. Worth keeping. I still have that drawing. It's framed. It hangs in my office at work, right next to my accounting degree. And every time I have a bad day, every time a spreadsheet breaks or a client yells or I feel like I'm just a boring guy in a boring job doing boring things, I look at that drawing, I look at that picture of me asleep in a garage full of ice shavings, and I remember that I am not just an accountant. I am not just a guy who pays bills and mows lawns and forgets to take out the trash. I am a dad. I am Lily's dad, and one time, one glorious, ridiculous, completely insane time, I made her an ice sculpture. I made her magic. I made her believe that her dad could do anything, even if it meant destroying a freezer. Even if it meant terrifying my neighbor. Even if it meant spending $600 on something that lasted 4 hours. Even if it meant becoming a local legend. The guy who asked a cop how to dispose of a 200-pound solid lump. Because here's the moral. Here's the thing I want you to take away from this whole stupid story, being a parent. Being a person who loves someone enough to make a complete fool of yourself. That's not about the result, it's not about the sculpture, it's not about the party, it's not about the money or the time or the effort, it's about showing up. It's about being willing to try something impossible and fail spectacularly, and still have your kid look at you like you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's about the 3 a.m. moments, the exhausted moments. The moments where nobody is watching except your 5-year-old daughter, who sees you asleep in a chair with blue hands, and thinks, "That's my hero." So yeah, TIFU, I absolutely, positively, without a doubt effed up. I destroyed property, I terrified a retired police officer, I flooded my garage, I spent way too much money, I turned myself into a neighborhood joke, I did everything wrong, but you know what? I'd do it again in a heartbeat. With a worse freezer and a more suspicious opening line and even more blue dye. Because at the end of the day, at the end of all the chaos and panic and melted ice, I got a drawing, I got a Ziploc bag of magic ice. I got a memory that my daughter will carry with her forever, and I got a best friend out of Gary, who, by the way, still tells the story at every barbecue. He tells it with embellishments now, in his version. I was wearing a trench coat and sunglasses when I approached him. In his version, the ice sculpture was 6 feet tall and I carved it with a chainsaw while riding a unicycle. In his version, Sarah showed up with a flamethrower to destroy the evidence, and every time he tells it, everyone laughs and I laugh too because it's funny, it's so funny, life is funny, parenting is funny. The fact that we care so much about these tiny humans that will literally freeze our garages and cut up appliances and spend our savings on frozen water, that's funny and beautiful and absolutely worth it. So if you're out there and you're a dad or a mom or an aunt or an uncle or anyone who loves a kid enough to be completely ridiculous for them, I want you to hear this. I want you to really hear it. The ice will melt. The money will be spent, the freezer will die, the neighbor will think you're a criminal, the wife will make you do dishes for 3 months, the garage will never be the same, but the love stays frozen forever in a Ziploc bag. In a crayon drawing, in the heart of a 5-year-old girl who thinks her daddy can make magic, and that is worth every single drop of blue water, so that's my story. That's how I TIFU by asking my neighbor how to dispose of a 200-pound solid lump before it turned into liquid. That's how I accidentally became a criminal suspect, an ice sculptor, a local legend, and the best daddy in the whole world. Gary, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I almost gave you a heart attack, but also, thank you for not calling the cops, and thank you for being the kind of neighbor who shows up with a winch and a case of beer when everything is falling apart. Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm sorry about the $600, the dishes are almost done, and yes, I'll get the Costco cake next year, but maybe, just maybe, I'll also make a smaller ice sculpture, like a snowman. Something manageable, something that won't require cutting appliances in half. And Lily, if you're reading this someday, when you're older, when you have kids of your own, I want you to know that you were worth every frozen finger, every sleepless night. Every panicked moment, every blue stain, you were worth it all. And if your kid ever wants a giant ice sculpture for their birthday, call me, I'll help, I'll bring the chisels, I'll bring the dye, I'll bring the blind confidence. Just maybe warn the neighbors first. That's all, folks, that's the whole story, from frozen disaster to melted magic, from criminal suspicion to neighborhood legend, from an $80 chest freezer to a Ziploc bag of forever. Thanks for reading. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you ever need to dispose of a 200-pound solid lump, make sure you mention it's Disney-related. Trust me on this one, it saves a lot of awkward explanations. Peace out, stay frosty. And never, ever underestimate the power of a dad with a dream and a YouTube tutorial. The end. Wait, one more thing I almost forgot. Remember that piece of ice Lily saved? The golf ball-sized chunk in the Ziploc bag. It's still in our freezer. 3 years later, it's smaller now, about the size of a marble, but it's still there, still blue, still magic, and every year on Lily's birthday, we take it out, we hold it up to the light, we remember. And then we put it back because some things, some frozen, ridiculous, beautiful things, aren't meant to melt completely. Some things are meant to last. Okay, now it's really the end, for real this time, bye.